Hello, I'm Dr. Harriet Fraad.
And I'm Julianna Forlano here with our podcast, Capitalism Hits Home.
This is a presentation and a podcast about the mutual shaping of capitalism, class, gender, race, and all the aspects of our personal and home lives.
We aim to educate, activate, and even alleviate some of the burdens we all experience living in a capitalist USA.
This podcast is brought to you by Democracy at Work. And today, we are going to continue the discussion of mass murder.
That sounds great. Somehow it's like, oh God, when Harriet and I were preparing for this, I was like, oh, it's hard to even prepare and talk about this. You hear it so much in the media, as Harriet said on the first, as you said, Harriet, on the first episode where we spoke about this, we had 45 mass shootings. That doesn't even count the other shootings. These are just the mass shootings happening in the USA in over the course of, 45 days or a month? I can't even keep track anymore.
Month, 30 days,
1 month.
days.
30 days, 45 shootings. And so we said that we have to talk about it. We have to talk about the intersection of those shootings with capitalism. And if you missed if you're just tuning in to this one, I do suggest going back and listening to the podcast right before this, because that's where Harriet and I, mostly Harriet, laid the groundwork for the disconnection that underlies what drives some of these people who commit the mass murders to commit those mass murders. Things like the undermining of our economy, the undermining of labor unions, the fact that, we talked about many things. So I do encourage you to go back and listen to that. We didn't get it all. We didn't finish it all. So we're back to talk a little bit, about what needs to be done in terms of how we can deal with this. Harriet, I wanted to start. Do you know how hard it is for me to get my thyroid medicine? This is related here. It is practically impossible. I have to get a blood test every 3 months in order to get thyroid medicine, which is not a Schedule I drug. It's not addictive. I don't know why it's so hard to get thyroid medicine when you've had a thyroid condition for, a decade. There's no reason why firearms should not be subjected to at least as many health and safety rules as pharmaceuticals and cars. This would be one way of stopping the flood of guns that wind up in the hands of people who have been crushed under our capitalist system and who wind up taking these drastic actions that we've been talking about.
Yes, well, this is another example of where the snake of capitalism rears its ugly head, because one of the reasons we don't take those reasonable precautions and we don't have a cultural campaign against gun violence is that the NRA wants to sell guns. They're not a nonprofit, as they stated. They are a vehicle for pushing gun use and equating it with masculinity, as we talked about in our last episode. So that would be why. They don't want to make it harder. They want to make it easier for everyone to buy not only one gun, but lots of guns.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it would interfere with the capitalist marketplace. And gun companies and weapons manufacturers are some of the biggest corporations in the United States. And they have an outsized role to play in the decisions of our legislators.
One of the things that's been suggested is a licensing system for gun ownership, like automobiles, with periodic renewals, and that the licensing agency also needs to oversee firearms training. And the training would undercut a major source of NRA revenue and membership, because people go to the NRA to get their training and their licensing, etc. And then they get on the PR list and the propaganda list from the NRA, and they're off to the races supporting that, feeling that connection that we discussed that is missing, that capitalism destroys for people, they find it in membership to the National Rifle Association. They feel like they're part of something. And, then it's a disaster.
It is. And, they do make a point of being very nice to you when you buy a gun. They solicit you. They give you, opportunities to learn to be a sharpshooter. You can go to meetings. You have a sense that you are belonging to this very male club. It is a way of reasserting America's masculinity in the worst, most stereotyped way. For example, they have a special target practice, the ex-girlfriend target. When you shoot the target, it begins to bleed, and by the time you're finished, you've shot her to bits and there's blood gushing everywhere. There is
horrified.
not equivalent for your ex-boyfriend target. Not that I'm suggesting that.
Wow, this is really, I had no idea. I'm horrified at this. And I need a minute to come back from the horror.
Yeah,
it's disgusting.
Punch. It really is a culture of hyper-masculinity.
And we're talking about mass shootings, but most of the mass shootings are like 45 and 30 days. This is a disaster. But the disaster is really that more shootings are domestic abuse shootings than there are mass shootings, domestic violence shootings, and cops shoot more people than are being shot by mass shootings. More.
That's right.
We're seeing that all over the place. So these things need to be just kind of put out there. There are other things that we can do. When I'm looking these things up, I was absolutely disgusted. But, other things than like, let's have a list and put people on the list if they're not allowed to, if they shouldn't have a gun because they've committed domestic violence. Although in most states, that is not enough to get you on that list. You could beat the hell out of someone, threaten them, threaten your woman. Mostly, this is what we're talking about here, and still be able to go get another gun. It's fine. But the gun manufacturers have legal protections. They're granted under the law. It's the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which gives gun industry immunity from most lawsuits. And also there is the Dickey Amendment, which we could get rid of, which blocks federal funding into researching gun violence. So basically, it's a gag order about researching gun violence that, of course, might come up with, hey, it's the guns, that are part of the problem here. So if we could repeal those two things, that would also be helpful.
But also they would really need to not only have the red flag law, which flags authorities to look at people who might be using guns dangerously. They should pursue it. The guy from FedEx who just killed all those, I think he killed 8 people, there was a red flag warning because his mother reported that he was saying that he wanted to die by cop, which means kill enough people so the cops would come in and kill him. But he wasn't deemed unworthy of having an automatic rifle.
Oh,
so
God.
You have to have it enforced.
Police officers also have unique gun rights that could be revoked. By the way, they have far higher rates of suicide, police officers and ex-police officers, than the general population, and also domestic violence, far higher rates. You can repeal the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act, which is what it's called, which allows current and retired police to carry a concealed weapon anywhere in the country, regardless of your local or state laws. There are, that would be a good place to start. Suicides is another thing. I think it's domestic violence and suicides account for more than just the mass shootings, but you don't really hear about domestic violence issues as much on TV because it's not sensationalized in the way killing children at a grocery store is or something like that.
Also, so there are people like Lauren Boebert, Two Gun Lauren, the legislator who proudly wears her guns even where it isn't allowed, because it's an emblem of defiance that they call freedom. The way Americans get away with defining freedom as asserting individuality in a narcissistic way, rather than the freedom to be part of something wonderful, which we do together. That is a very perverse idea. So you have the freedom to refuse to wear your mask, even though you may be infecting everyone else. It's the capitalist narcissism that it's about me and what I want to do. It's not me to be free because I am part of something wonderful. I am cared for and I care for others. It's me asserting myself in a vacuum, victimizing people without concern.
Harriet, this is going to certainly get us in trouble, but I am a believer that when you see something, kind of monkey see, monkey do, when you see something, you visualize it. And then maybe you're not seeing the reality of what happens when you shoot children with, not that you'd care if you were about to shoot them, but with high capacity weapons that are only used in wars. You can see all that happen and practice it. As you said, the NRA lets you practice shooting your girlfriend and they give you a bloody thing so that you watch her die. There are video games. I find television, I mentioned this in the last episode, like really hard to watch because it's basically all shooting zombies and like overly sexualized using of each other. That's mostly what TV is these days. Even cartoons on Disney, but don't get me started there. What are your thoughts about the fact that, there's, Twitch, it's a platform where most of the channels are people watching each other play these war games, shoot people. That's, in these like virtual reality type scenarios, you just go and shoot people. How is it from a psychological standpoint? Don't you think that those are contributing to the fact that people are depersonalized? They're separated from each other. They don't even recognize that when you shoot people in real life, they get hurt. They get hurt. And I think I was really struck by it when I went to France because I'm interested in child development. I always look at child care centers and I look at toy stores. There were no toy guns in the French stores. If you go to an American toy store, they almost always have guns for boys to play with. I have to tell you,
guns.
I have a little girl, and she was not interested in guns until she went to school, and the boys were playing shoot guns with sticks. Somehow they know about guns, even if they don't. At the school she goes to, they don't allow toys. You can't bring any of your own toys in, and they don't have guns there, so the kids pick up sticks and make guns out of them. It's, this brings us to like the education system. Could we do something there to help teach people not about the French and Indian War, as my 8-year-old nephew is learning in third grade, learning about the French and Indian War, as opposed to learning about peace and connection, learning about social interaction, learning about sharing. You could learn about any number of peaceful things that were happening. Why teach kids about war at that age and then wonder why we have a problem with people shooting each other?
Exactly. And the way they show, even as a little kid, when I watched my first television, Hopalong Cassidy, and his ethnic sidekick, which they always have. But, it was another redskin bites the dust. People just fall off their horse. They're not bleeding. Their families aren't bereaved. There's just another one down. The reality of injury is not there. Plus, we don't have the opposite. It's not only in video games, and it's also on ads and in television. They're not showing men being tender, men being friends, boys playing house, and girls do it too. I just want to finish this because it's so poignant. Girls do the same thing, and they do the same thing to boys. They assume boys are violent, and they don't want to have to do with them. I remember when, as a consultant in daycare, I was trying to get these little girls to include a shy boy in their game. they were playing house, and he had no one to play with and wanted to play with him. They kicked him out. So I said, look, why don't you let him play house too? Because he could be the father. And as soon as I got what they thought was out of earshot, they said, yeah, you be the father. You're at work all day. Get out. Okay.
Yes. Oh, my daughter and I started watching Mr. Rogers, and I'm personally very much, he was in they made movies and all of this. He was very much in the pop culture realm over the past couple of years, but we started watching the actual Mr. Rogers, and the timing and the pace and the gentleness and the hello friend and the I care about my neighbor and all of that is just in incredible stark contrast. I don't think anything like that would be put on TV today. Right now we have Daniel Tiger, which is a cartoon based off of Mr. Rogers' puppet character, but it's still kind of jazzy and fun. It's not a real person. It's a cartoon, not a real person acting. It almost seems suspect, like Mr. Rogers is acting the way I would imagine someone who wanted to give candy out of the back of a van to my child would act. It's suspect when people are acting kind and soft and gentle in America.
That's really true. In fact, I had a client whose very chauvinist husband was teaching their son, when she had him watch Mr. Rogers, to say, Mr. Rogers is a because anyone who was kind and gentle at a slower than hyped up pace was highly suspect in this man's eyes. That there's something about this hyper-masculinist culture that doesn't allow both children to be accepting of the entire range of human emotions. Tenderness isn't part of it, particularly for boys who are mocked when they're tender and kind.
I also feel like the sense of impotence that people have in the face of a democracy that is currently really just completely controlled by corporations is adding to this. There's just this sense of impetus. I mean, our podcast is supported by a group called Democracy at Work that helps people understand and this idea of ownership, worker co-ops, worker ownership of the workplace. Therefore, even if I am the lowest man on the totem pole, I'm still important. I still get a vote. I still get my input heard. The person who picks up the mail still knows something that's important about the company, and therefore you can have a sense of power at your workplace, a sense of contribution. It's the structure of top-down capitalism and the way our workplaces are organized in sort of a patriarchal capitalistic fashion, top-down, that also adds to people's sense of impotence, both in the workplace and in our government. Your thoughts, Harriet?
Well, one of the times when mass murder really got off and running in the 1980s, and it was called going postal because it began at the post office when they replaced the practice of promoting people to supervisory positions who knew the job and who had worked in the postal system. And Reagan, terrible hater of labor, replaced that practice with putting in business school graduates who saw the postal workers with whom they were working as adversaries who had to be speeded up, monitored, and pushed, and were not trusted. It was not anymore that we're working together, we all understand each other's jobs. And it drove people mad. So that in the 80s, the term going postal stood for mass murder. They did something about the structure of the post office. They realized there was that problem. And so now it isn't at the post offices, it's everywhere else that people are shooting groups of people. But what you point out is so
That's interesting.
important.
It's at FedEx. It's at FedEx. FedEx is
Right,
kind of the capitalistic alternative to the post office.
exactly. Without the union structure, the post office has the biggest union in the United States, 300,000 people, and it is a diverse employer, diversity in terms of gender, diversity in terms of ethnicity and race. And it has been replaced by FedEx, a private company with horrible speed up, where people have to go to the bathroom in paper bags because they have to deliver so many
Yeah.
packages at such a high rate of
Disgusting.
speed, and the impotence that people feel because they don't have a union, because they don't have a counterforce, which they can only have in their number, because as individuals with this individualistic culture, they won't have that power. It comes with a group uniting that power. And that's the antidote to this terrible problem of mass shootings that we have.
We have to
Connect.
attack it on so many ways. One of the things I was reading was in Jacobin magazine about like a socialist response to gun violence, and it included that we need to look at this as a healthcare crisis, and it talked about how there are people. Well, it's very hard to do if you can't research it and then see what the research says. But it was talking about how there is some hope on the horizon, that the domestic violence advocates are getting together with the like the Parkland School movement and the anti-school shooting movement, and the other anti-mass shooting movements that are out there, as well as the anti-suicide folks are starting to all get together to see that the crisis of gun violence isn't separate crises, and they are all driven by the things that we've all talked about, which of course comes back to capitalism, because militarism is part of capitalism. And then the writer of the article actually really encouraged the movement to also look overseas, so that the people who are experiencing gun violence in Chicago find common cause with people who are experiencing gun violence and weapons violence in Iraq, right? Because it's all kind of coming from the exact same, all stemming from the exact same mental illness that is making cash out of weapons.
And we can't forget that America is the biggest weapons producer in the world. When there are these conflicts around the world repeatedly reported on, I always think, where'd they buy the guns? And one of the reasons that America has forever wars, we're in 130 countries around the world, is so that the weapons manufacturers can get a gift. I think that's why Syria was bombed shortly after Biden came in. It was his gesture. Don't worry, you'll still be able to sell your weapons. Of course, tens of thousands of people's lives were destroyed, but whatever. It's collateral damage when you're making money.
And this rhetoric of these are weapons of war, they should be certain when people are trying to get certain high capacity magazines and that kind of thing, those kind of weapons legislated out so that you can't have them. They talk about them as in that they are weapons of war. But why do we need that? Could we try diplomacy a little bit, a little bit more than war? They're people who are the victims of those weapons in war are still victims of gun violence.
That's right. And America has a defense industry, but we've never been invaded. It should be an offense industry.
Yeah, war
because
industry.
We invade other people. China's never invaded anybody, even though they're being touted as a terrible country, and they are authoritarian and bad in some ways. Russia's never invaded anybody that wasn't, allied with them, that wasn't considered part of their country. And we Americans seem to be very approving of the $718 billion that they are giving for the wars that We have failed every war. We have lost every war, or had a divided
Not if you're the
loss.
arms, not if you're the arms manufacturers. You win no matter what.
That's
You
a
always
great point,
win.
Juliana. You always win because you're selling more and more, only to be destroyed and having to be replenished. And the logic that you have to then maintain and store these weapons seems to be fine in the weapons industry. It wasn't for the pandemic supplies. It was too expensive to store those when you're not using them.
Well, I
These
think
are
it's
weird
wonderful that these groups, these anti-war groups, anti-domestic violence, anti-suicide prevention groups, anti-mass shootings, and anti-weaponry on the streets groups, and even police accountability groups are coming together to
It's
see
wonderful.
the intersection of their causes, and that is actually very heartening, and I'm glad to have seen that as I looked into this. We are at the end of our time. I almost can't believe it. This went by so quickly. One of the quickest ones. I feel like this went by as one of the fastest ones we've ever done.
Yeah, and we hope that the anti-capitalists join the other groups so that we really could stem the slaughter in which we are the leaders of the world.
Well, thank you so much, Harriet, for bringing, obviously, always the clarity that you bring to this podcast. I'm really grateful to have been a part of it. I'm having to step back and take a pause. But we're calling it a pause. We're not really sure how long
Yes,
the
and we
pause
will
is
never
going to be.
replace you, but we will have another person come and welcome
Yes,
you
that's
back.
good. And I will be happy to support that in all I can do, because I think capitalism hits home, and the subject matter that's covered here by whomever is with you is just so important. And it has been my pleasure to be part of this. If you're wondering, you can follow me on Twitter at Julianna Forlano. That's where I'll be, and you can find me there. But basically, it's just the pandemic and the pressures of what is happening in life require me to step back from this project, and I do so with great sadness.
And I see you step back with great sadness as well, because you're an amazing partner to work with and think with and talk with.
Well, I'm still part of the Democracy at Work family, so hopefully I'll be popping up here and there. And I do want to thank everyone who helps make this podcast, including Brian Issam, Maria Carmonella Mania, Liz Phillips, the whole team at Democracy at Work for making this podcast possible. And thanks to our listeners and supporters. I am still around. I will still be poking in, and I'm not going necessarily anywhere. I just won't be part of the podcast. Harriet, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening and watching. So long.